Right, so hello and thank you to everyone who have joined us this afternoon. My name's Laurie Barnes and I'm the CTO at Automate UK. I'm here to do a quick introduction and then hand over to the man who really knows what he's talking about, David. Just some housekeeping. Please add any questions you have to the question and answers tab. You'll see at the bottom of the screen and we'll answer your questions at the end. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website later today. This is one of the first technical style webinars that we are doing since becoming Automate UK, and we plan to carry on with these in the future. What we really want to know is what topics that you would like us to tackle. So please let us know either on the Q&A or drop us an email afterwards. Also, there'll be a place at the end of the presentation for you to answer some questions for us on one of those or any other topics you'd like. So I'm very pleased to thank Rockwell Automation for providing us with the pre-release version of their ebook, A Guide to the Machinery Regulation, which I hope you've had a chance to read before this afternoon. This guide is an overview to the changes that have been made to the machinery regulations. And we have a little time before these become solid, but that time will be upon us within the blink of an eye. So it's really important that we know what we need to do. So David is here this afternoon to present in a little more detail the changes that are going to happen. He has worked for Rockwell Automation since 1999 and is responsible for EU regulatory affairs and is ideally placed to speak about these changes. So with not wanting to waste any more of his valuable time or to take up your time with him, I'd like to hand over to David for this afternoon's webinar. Thank you, David, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. Yeah, welcome everybody to this update. So we're priming the route to compliance, the main focus being OEMs. Just a little bit about me, Laurie's already said, I've been at Rockwell for 26 years. I sit on a number of national, European and international standards committees. I'll go into them just very briefly, just to give you an idea, because they're all kind of pertinent to the topic of the machinery regulation. And I'm sure some of you will be aware of some of the standards that are developed in these technical committees. So TC44 deals with electrotechnical aspects. So you think of the likes of IEC 60204-1 or 62061 that deals with safety integrity levels. TC199, you'll probably be well aware of the kind of Type A standard that's developed in that committee as one of the many standards, which is ISO 12100. Then we have TC65 that deals with 62443, which we'll all become more and more aware of as time goes by. TC299 robotics, and then TC313 for packaging machinery. And then the last one is a relatively new working group. It's Senelec TC44X, and that's where we're developing a standard specifically aimed at the machinery regulation for cybersecurity aspects. So that's just a quick kind of mop up. While I'm on the kind of mopping up as well, I'll do a quick overview of the existing and current machinery directive. And then I'll dive into the new machinery regulation, covering some of the key dates, the change within that document compared to 0642 EC, touch a little bit on fully or partially self-evolving behaviour as a topic in itself, compliance route, and then into the essential health and safety requirements. There's a lot of key standards. I'm only going to pick one or two, and then what do I have to do next in light of the dates? So machinery directive.
David.
Yeah.
Could you just turn your video off because you're getting a little bit of
Okay.
It's not too bad, but it just keeps cutting in and out a little bit.
Right,
Thank
okay.
you.
I'll try that. Okay. So machinery directive, it's been applicable since December 2009. Applies to machinery, interchangeable equipment, safety components, and then we're into chains and lifting accessories and partly completed machinery. And that is the successor to the original machinery directive going back to 89. So, we had 20 years before we had an update. We're now into kind of 14 years since the last update to the machinery regulation. If you notice, there was a survey done by the Commission 3 or 4 years ago looking at how applicable the machinery directive is. And it was deemed somewhat out of date, looking at the advances in technology, primarily on artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and then the huge take-up of robotics. So the new regulation was reorganized to tackle some of these topics. In terms of the machinery directive, who does it affect? So that's anybody building machinery or partly completed machinery supplying within or into the European Economic Area. Clearly addressing OEMs, but it also addresses end users building their own machinery. And it also includes end users that do any significant modification to machines. As an example, changing the speed could be deemed to be a significant modification, or adding end-of-line robots. And then second-hand equipment entering into the European market for the first time are all in scope of the machinery directive. I mentioned some of the key standards. ISO 12100 is a type A standard, pretty key. And I guess that was one of the changes in the 0642 revision of the machinery directive, where we then had a mandate for OEMs to complete a risk assessment, which is essentially key to compliance. So you're doing your identification of hazards, you're effectively doing your TABRA, task-based risk assessment. And then from that information, you do your hierarchy of measures. Can you design it out? We're into safeguards and information for use. And then the subsequent output from that is the necessary documentation. So generating a technical file, doing your declaration of conformity or incorporation, affixing your CE mark, and then you're doing either self-certification or you're using a notified body, depending if you fall in the scope of Annex 4 machinery. So, I mean, that's where we are just now currently, and will continue to be for a year or two, and then that changes slightly. One other addition is there is a new guide. It was issued earlier on this year with some kind of minor changes, but maybe a major one is the previous guide inferred that documentation should be in paper copies. So your instruction handbook, your declarations. Now the machinery directive didn't actually say that, the guide did, but that is how it has been interpreted, that you had to supply your documentation in paper format. So that's been kind of clarified in the new guide, and there's now an allowance for digital documentation for your manuals and for your CE marking documentation. So that's linked to the machinery regulation, which is essentially the main topic for today. So EU 2023-1230. Who's interested in that? All the people that I mentioned before, so primarily OEMs, but also end users and integrators. And essentially, the new regulation now has a new compliance route. There is a change to the annexes. There is some fairly significant additions to the essential health and safety requirements. It allows for digital documentation, which is related in the new guidance. And maybe for me, the biggest impact from the new regulation is the addition of cyber security requirements. And again, just to link back to end users, so we still have and continue to have the use of work equipment directive for workers at work. And you'll note there that for an end user to comply with that, you have to comply with the provisions of any relevant community directive which is applicable. So in this case, it would be the machinery directive, or moving forwards, potentially the machinery regulation. And any equipment placed into service after the implementation date, which I'll cover in a second, needs to meet this new regulation, you may have to update your company purchasing requirements if you're an end user, and you may have to do things differently in terms of modifications. So in terms of dates for the regulation, it was published last year, 29th of June. We had an entry into force last year of July, and then we had a 42-month transition period, which makes application date for the new regulation the 20th of January 2027. Maybe just some points on that. The transition period is not necessarily for you as an OEM, it's for member states in terms of reporting requirements. So they have a transition period. There is no transition period for the regulation itself. We have the date there, the 20th of January, with a sharp cutoff. So you would do the machinery directive. If you shipped a machine on the 19th of January 2027, you would ship that machine with your declaration complying with the machinery directive currently. And then come the 20th of January 2027, you would ship with the new machinery regulation and CE mark accordingly, which in my opinion is a bit of a nonsense. I think a transition period would have been good, but that's how the Commission have laid this out. So I think it may be more commercial. If you're an end user, you may have some requirements regardless of the only requiring compliance to the machinery directive, which we'll talk about in a second, some of the new requirements. One other thing is it's not a directive like the current machinery directive, it is a regulation. As such, it's adopted by all the member states on the same day, no change of date of entry and no modification. So there is no national transposition of that directive into national law. It's applied universally across all the member states. Compliance around the new machinery regulation continues at the moment. I'd caveat that, using harmonised standards. And therein lies a challenge. We have over 800 standards that provide presumption of conformity to the machinery directive. We'll have over 800 plus that will do the same for the machinery regulation. And if you consider we're approaching quickly the end of 2024, realistically, we want to have standards 2026 for machine builders, because they'll be essentially, some of them will be building their machines now for delivery in 2027. It leaves very little time to do anything. As an example, I talked about the packaging standard I sit on. We have some standards that we've been working on in excess of 10 years, and they're still not harmonised yet. So it's a real challenge for the standards committees. And then there'll be some new ones that are required for some of the new essential health and safety requirements that are listed in the machinery regs. And one thing on there, Senelec did a survey a couple of years ago, and just looking at clause 119, the one that deals with protection against corruption, it was estimated that around 50% of all Type C standards would be affected by that and would need a rewrite. So it is a challenge from a standardization perspective, and we're still looking for news on how we address that within Europe. Compliance, like I said, continues with that, but what about the UK? We're still using the supply machinery safety regulations. That still links to 2006/42, but what do we do moving forwards? So I plucked some of this information from a recent update by OPSS. So the Product Safety and Metrology Regulations 2024 have been proposed. And in there, there's continued recognition of the current EU requirements for 21 regulations. The 21 regulations are fairly broad. There's machinery, of course, in there, toys through to ROS. So we're continuing to tie ourselves to some of the European regulations, which is good for business. And a process to make it easier for businesses to use UK CE marking. So we still have that on the on the agenda to an extent. And if anybody had a look at the King's speech earlier in September, it essentially says the same there. And then this new bill, it's going to enable the UK to manage our own product regulations. And the Department of Business and Trade, who's dealing with this, will be able to either, and this is important to note, continue or stop recognition and mirror the new rules or make their own when it's in the interests of our businesses and consumers. So that leaves the door open to either stay linked to European legislation or we sail off and do our own thing. I'm pretty sure, I'm speaking for most of you, but to have divergence in documentation is just cost. I don't see any benefit in doing things differently, but we'll wait to see. And then as a quick kind of recap there, they've covered some of the aspects that this regulation and metrology bill will cover. And again, it reinforces, enables the UK to respond to changes to EU rules and either continue or stop recognition. So that's a quick update, and I'm sure Laurie at the end will maybe have something else to say about this because it's going to be a hot topic as we move forwards. So back to the machinery regulation, I mentioned there's a new annex structure. So the essential health and safety requirements are now in Annex 3. That's currently Annex 1 of the machinery directive. And the changes has been tweaked, and I think it makes a more logical flow to the application of the regulation. So Annex 1 is the categories of machinery, and from that we'll dictate what do we do in terms of EHSRs and our technical files, declarations and assessments. So there is a bit of a flow there. So just going into the annexes in a bit more detail. So Annex 1, categories of machinery, that was current or is currently Annex 4, deals with particular categories of machine, and Annex 1 is split into two parts. So we've got Part A, which deals with removable mechanical transmission devices, guards for removable mechanical transmission devices, servicing lifts, portable cartridge fixings. And Part A has a requirement for that category of machinery to go through notified body. There is no self-assessment route there. And included into Part A, and like I said on the study that was done a couple of years ago, a nod towards artificial intelligence. And that's essentially what we're talking about here with fully or partially self-evolving behavior using machine learning approaches, ensuring safety functions for safety components and for embedded systems within machinery. So Part A, the current sections of Annex 4 and these new sections here will require a notified body. And then Part B is the remaining items in Annex 4, so injection molding and woodworking equipment are Part B. That doesn't necessarily need a type examination from a notified body, although you can follow that route. You can equally follow a harmonised standard, and you'll meet the requirements for Annex 1 Part B through self-assessment, assuming there's a harmonised standard available. Article 6, worthwhile pointing this out. There is an element where that Annex 1 could change through time. I know there has been some proposals for potential high-risk machinery being included into Annex 1, either Part A or Part B. For an example, travelators and palletizers, there was some discussion as to whether they should be included in the list. And therein, like I said, lies the challenge. I talked about packaging equipment and how long it's taken to develop a standard. So EN 415-4 is still not harmonised. So if palletizers were included into Annex 1 Part B, there would be no harmonised standard to give you presumption of conformity, and you would be forced to go to a notified body. So implications for this could be somewhat serious in terms of cost for business. So it's worthwhile keeping an eye on developments here. And I think the timelines is a kind of notification period around about 6 months. And that's triggered by member states informing the Commission of a concern about a category of machinery they feel is not suitably covered and want included into Annex 1. Then we go into Annex 2, the indicative list of safety components. So there's some new additions in there. So we see software that deals with safety functions being included. And we see the self-evolving behavior part again for components. And we also have filtration systems have been added in there as well for the indicative list. Procedure, like I said, there is somewhat greater emphasis on third-party approval. Self-certification to the machinery regulation is possible, of course. If your machine category falls into Annex 1 Part B and you use a harmonized standard or a common specification, you can do it that way. Or you're going to a notified body. And if you're not listed in Annex 1, there is a preference to use harmonized standards, but of course you can use whatever standard you like. I did hint at that earlier on. That's an issue we are all closely following, pending the output from the Malamud case, where there was a challenge made to the Commission to provide standards free of charge that was successful. So we're waiting on the output from that case and the deliberations of Sensenelec as to how we move forwards. So again, watch the space. We'll give you updates as we find out. Regardless, for both the options above, you've got your internal production checks in Annex 6. That's not changed too much to the current machinery directive. Then we get into Annex 3. So we're into the EHSRs, and this is the kind of the meat behind this presentation. So there is some key additions. So there's ergonomics, and that addresses AI to an extent. The one topic I want to talk about is the protection against corruption. Allied to that is the requirement for a tracing log in the control system, somewhat allied to the protection against corruption. And then we've got some new EHSRs that deal with autonomous mobile machinery. That's alluding to the study again, looking at robotics, AMRs, AGVs as being in scope. Ergonomics, I'll not talk too much on this, but there is a requirement. This is the text. Ergonomics, you've got to adapt to the human-machine interface to foreseeable characteristics of the operators. With intended fully or partially self-evolving behavior or logic. I'll be honest, I don't know what they intend to come out of that. And again, we're looking for guidance as that develops. But suffice to say, I've not had any particular requests with AI and the adaptation of the HMI to somebody approaching the machine. But that's kind of what that's alluding to. And you can see here, the machine is intended to respond to people adequately and appropriately. So there is an element here of, like I said, robotics interacting with humans, and there has to be greater communication. And you can see here verbally through words, non-verbally through gestures, facial expressions, or body movements. And the machine has to respond appropriately to these gestures. So it's a little bit ahead of time, but it's certainly future-proofing the machinery regulation with that clause. Then getting on to the cybersecurity requirements, it's a bit odd as Rockwell Automation, where all our devices are somewhat connected, but that connectivity introduces a potential, and that kind of genie's out the bottle now. Every machine is connected to a certain extent, and we've just got to mitigate against that. So I'm going to go through the clause of 1.1.9. This is a legal text. So the machinery or related product shall be designed and constructed so that connection to it of another device via any feature of the connected device itself, or via any remote device that communicates with the machinery or related product, does not lead to a hazardous situation. Now that, in my opinion, is a really hard requirement coming from the legal text. So if you connect any device with any kind of connectivity there, you're kind of having to guarantee it doesn't lead to a hazardous situation. Now, bear in mind that the text now includes nefarious actors. That's an extremely hard requirement. I'm just going to pause on that for a second, because this is where we really need some guidance coming from the Commission as to how we interpret this first paragraph of this brand new EHSR. And I think if the text had read, you mitigate as opposed to doesn't lead to a hazardous situation, it would have been slightly better. And I'm hoping the guidance kind of reads somewhat like that. We then have some requirements on the hardware component. If it's transmitting signal or data, is relevant for connection or access to software that is critical for the compliance of the machine. It's going to be designed so it's adequately protected against accidental or intentional corruption. And that's new compared to what we had in the machinery directive. We're now having to cover off criminal acts, essentially, with intentional corruption. So that's quite a hard requirement as well. And then it goes on, the machinery or related product. That related product potentially affects companies like us as Rockwell, where we've got safety devices that are connected. But yeah, the machinery or related product shall collect evidence of legitimate or illegitimate intervention in that hardware component when relevant for connection or access to software is critical for the compliance of the machinery or related product. Again, quite a hard requirement that needs some further guidance. I have got some background information here. It's not all bad. Then we go on to software and data that are critical for the compliance of the machine. And again, we've got similar words, adequately protected against accidental or intentional corruption. Slightly better language there in terms of adequately protected, as opposed to doesn't lead to a hazardous situation. But again, the term there, intentional corruption, comes up again. A slightly easier requirement there, the machinery-related product shall identify the software installed in it that is necessary for it to operate safely, and shall be able to provide the information at all times in an easily accessible form. But we're already working on some of the guidance for that. The machinery-related product shall collect evidence of legitimate or illegitimate interventions in the software or modification of the program. So again, we've got to capture some of that information, and machine builders have to be able to capture that. Then we get into the control system. So the control system shall be designed and constructed to prevent hazardous situations from occurring. Now, some of this language is already there in the machinery directive. So withstand appropriate to circumstances and risks, the intended operating stresses, and intended and unintended external influences, including reasonably foreseeable malicious attempts. So we're looking at nefarious actors here, and we've got to do something to have some form of countermeasure to address that. We then have the tracing log requirement. So tracing log of data generated in relation to an intervention, versions of software uploaded, and that's going to be enabled for 5 years after such upload. So there now is an element in the machinery regulation for some form of life cycle management that lies on the shoulders of an OEM. As opposed to supplying the machine to the market and you're done, there's going to be some requirement for tracing logs and be able to demonstrate the conformity of the machinery after you've shipped that machine. Of course, that's from a reasonable request from a competent national authority. Then going off the topic of cyber, but there is aspects to it here. There is a definition of modification, and it goes on where such machinery products are subsequently modified by physical or digital means in a way that is not foreseen by the hazard or an existing risk. The modification shall be considered as substantial. So we've kind of got a definition of substantial modification. And then we go on and get some further text there. The repair and maintenance which doesn't affect the machinery or related products compliance, is deemed not to be a substantial modification. So there is an element, there's still a bit of a grey area there when you're doing stuff by digital means with modifications. What is substantial and what's just normal repair and maintenance operations. So on that, before I get into standards, the Commission have just implemented work on a guide to the machinery regulation. We are, as I say we, it's European trade associations are contributing to that work to get some guidance to this new EHSR 1.1.9 to give the reader a better idea of what is actually required here. So my expectation is at some point next year that guide will be released and give you a better idea of what the requirements are for your machines. Of course, allied to that is standards. So if I look at 12100 as our Type A standard for machinery, it deals with general principles for design and primarily risk assessment and risk reduction. So there was a new work item proposal to change the text that was voted positive, and the revised document they're currently working on has aspects of AI, machine learning, cyber is in the scope now. It was previously out of the scope there. And cybersecurity attacks with potential impacts to safety have to be considered. Now, just one point there. Your risk assessment will stay the same as you've currently done forever using 12100. Cyber doesn't introduce any new hazards, but it can generate hazardous events. So there is a linkage between 12100 and cyber here, but it's not all going to be contained in ISO 12100. And that is going out to national standards bodies. So there is a UK committee dealing with the revision of 12100. I chair that, part of MCE3. If anybody on this call wants to participate, you can let us know, because we'll be starting to work on UK input to the new work item proposal or the CD of the standard. Some additions here. So in 5.4, clause 5.4 of 12100, we have aspects here where we talk about malfunctions, and it deals with unintended self-evolving behavior of applied artificial intelligence. Now, it currently points to ISO TR 22100 Part 5. That's a little bit dated. We worked on that maybe 4 years ago. There is a newer ISO IC TR that I would suggest you want to look at. And also another reason for the machine not performing its intended function could be down to a cyber security breach. It goes on to say at the design stage, a machine manufacturer should observe basic principles, measures to minimize cyber security risks. Like I said, this is a committee draft subject to change. I think this language may change and start talking about security countermeasures to be distinct from safeguards. But we've included cyber security into this. We then have some additions to the software aspects. So we have this clause here, 63573, talking about embedded and application software. That's not changed too much, designed to satisfy the performance specification for the safety function, so that could be your PL or SOL rating. But it does go on to say protection against unauthorized safety-related software changes. So again, you're looking at corruption of data via possibly some form of cyber attack, and measures to protect against unauthorized software changes shall be implemented. So we're starting to focus in on the kind of mode selection aspects for machinery. We go on, we've got a clause currently dealing with cybersecurity and protection against corruption, with some very kind of basic measures. And the approach here is kind of layers of protection like you would see in safety instrumented systems. So it means to prevent unauthorized access to hardware, software, application software, configuration data, the prevention of accidental or unintended changes, the real simple one of air gapping, not always 100%, of course. Locking access to ports, control of remote access are all kind of rolled in there. And then we have a note to go and have a look at PREN 50742. And this revision of 12100, expectation is to have that out next year for vote. So that's moving pretty quick in terms of the requirements out of 12100. Again, like I said, there's a UK mirror working on that, and people are more than welcome to join. Now, on standardization efforts, there was a new work item proposal. Last year, we proposed that at the tail end of last year. It's Senelec TC44X, it's safety machinery, electrotechnical aspects, because we're dealing with cyber. And that has a UK secretariat in BSI. And that is dealing primarily with the protection against corruption. And that's the first safety machinery type B standard that's addressing cyber aspects. It is a blank sheet of paper. It's taken quite a lot of effort to get to some kind of document that can be voted on, and we are steadily working on that at the moment. So currently, like I said, it's a draft, working draft, is offering up 2 optional routes. So route A, if you all know the requirements of 62443, which deal with IACs and security levels, SLs, if you're a component supplier, we certainly at Rockwell, we're a fee with that 62443-4-1 and -2. Follow the requirements of that particular series of standards, and any additional requirements that are mopped up from the machinery regulation would be your route A approach. And route B, if you haven't been using 62443, you're a machine builder, we will have some basic requirements in route B to follow, and hopefully that gives you the presumption of conformity to 119 of the machinery regulation. And we envisage how this would work as if, as an example, there was a type C standard for a given machine. It has a gap in 119 currently. The idea is you would use your type C standard and 50742, and between them that gives you your presumption of conformity. But we are still awaiting some feedback from the Commission on that. Either way, route A and B, we're still looking to aspects of 62443. And if I look here as an example, from 62443, the control system shall provide the capability to identify and authenticate all human users. And that applies to individuals or single groups, i.e. maintenance. So there is an aspect now in the machinery regulation to identify and authenticate people. So that's kind of over and above what we do currently. So anybody can hit a button and select mode, some form of mode selection. I can see that changing through time. And that's certainly starting to bubble up into our standard here as well. So again, this is pulled from 62443 and somewhat embedded into our standard. And I'm just taking this as one topic as an example. So authentication, it can indeed be done by methods such as passwords or tokens, but I certainly see a technology driver towards MFA, multi-factor authentication, and it would be a combination of the above. It goes on to say the geographic location of human users can also be used as part of the authentication process, and start thinking about that for local and remote access. One other part of it is for control systems, the capability for immediate operator interaction is critical. There's an element there of potentially having your emergency switching off on a machine is your kind of last step action if you feel you've had a vulnerability exposed through a cyber attack. And yeah, in 62443-2-1 for the real kind of basic requirements policies for an end user site is first step is identify all human users, and then we start enforcing the permissions as a second step. So that proposal for 50742 was October last year. We had an initial expectation of that being ready in 12 months, but we're nowhere near that. It's more likely to be the middle of next year, having that standard, but I would say kind of watch this space pretty closely. And incidentally, we have also got a UK Mirror Committee dealing with cyber, again, via BSI. It's a panel group, so open to any experts. And again, if you're interested, you can let us know. So I guess what's next? So short term for machine builders, I would suggest you have a look at the machinery regulation. There's now quite a lot of collateral out there giving information. Laurie alluded to some of the ebook stuff that we've done already. Of course, there's other sources of the truth there. Identify what potentially affects you and your machinery, the changes, the new EHSRs. I mean, I've not talked about all the aspects of machinery regulation. There's aspects here for forestry equipment and collision with overhead power lines, as an example, as a new EHSR. I would say short term, start thinking about conducting some form of cyber threat assessment. We're currently in 50742 working on an informative annex on that to give you some idea of what that would look like in essence. If you've got any form of network, I would say conduct a vulnerability assessment. So we're starting to look at the key points of 62443 and doing an install base evaluation of all the kind of components within your machine. For end users, I would say review and update the purchasing policy. Start thinking about the new regulation for long-term projects, new machinery on the horizon. Start looking at your own company's cybersecurity policy. And essentially, we're looking at cyber hygiene for the machine. And with that, Laurie, I think I've kind of covered the salient points. I know it's quite a lot of slides there, maybe more like a video than a PowerPoint, but it was quite a lot to cover in a short period of time. But I think it'd be interesting to see if there's any questions. And I don't know if you want to add anything on the what next, Laurie.
Yeah, so thank you, David. That's excellent. Hopefully it's given everyone a really good overview of what they need to do, what they need to watch out for. If you do have any questions, please start putting them into the Q&As. We have a couple already. Yeah, as I said, this is one of our first. David and I have already, as he's already mentioned, cybersecurity is a big topic that's coming up. We've already talked about running another webinar just on that cybersecurity. It's something you really need to start thinking about in the future. And as David was talking about packaging standards, Automate UK, through myself, has now joined a number of BSI committees, one of them the Safety for Packaging Machinery, and we have been asked to support that with providing names of members that want to be involved on particular topics, one actually being palletizers, wrapping machines, so very relevant to what David was talking about. So watch this space. So one of the first questions we had, David, was is there any information you can provide on OEE condition monitoring and obsolescence? I think you covered this very briefly. I don't know if there's anything you can add to that.
Actually, condition monitoring is one of the facets that the Commission want included in all the regulations. So not covering it per se for cyber. I don't know if the condition monitoring is a condition of a machine in light of cyber. I'm thinking more condition monitoring in light of its efficiencies. But there is environmental aspects for machinery moving forwards, and there is a requirement for condition monitoring in there. That's maybe a topic for another day, actually, Laurie.
Yeah.
But it did come up in some policy exchanges, and a requirement for some of the Type C standards to address this. So I maybe won't go into it in depth, but maybe that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is actually, talking about packaging, there is a packaging standard that deals with condition monitoring. I'd have to dig out the standard reference, but it's part of the 415 series that deals with that.
Okay.
I'd say important to include it in thoughts for new machines. Yeah.
How do these updates affect trapped key interlocks? Has been another question.
In terms of cyber, or
well, in terms of the machinery regulation, I think.
Yeah. So the EHSRs haven't changed so much there. But it has an impact on the standards. So there is an ISO TS 19837 which deals with trapped key. That's actually all been rolled up into ISO 14119. And trapped key, the classification of interlocks is type 1 to type 5. Trapped key is a type 5 device. And that is going forward to be harmonized. So I don't think anything particularly changes for trapped key devices moving forwards.
Cool, good. We've had another one come through. Could you expand on the 5-year requirement to keep machine data? The gentleman or lady didn't quite catch the requirement. Thank you.
So you've seen the legal text for the requirement for logging of data. That is something that we are really kind of pushing the Commission in terms of the guidance to the machinery regulation, because it is really quite wide open. Our interpretation of that is being able to record interventions, and then we get into the topic of what is an intervention. Is that opening a guard door, or is that really recording a cybersecurity incident? Let's say it's the latter. The debate we're having in the working group is, do we record 1 of them, 10 of them, 1,000 of them? Because then it's given a bit of an overload on the system that's at the heart of the machine, and data logging requirements. So I don't have a perfect answer just yet, but we will have some clarity as things develop. That's why this is not a single gig, this update. I can see this continuing for a while as we get more and more clarity.
Yeah, definitely.
But there is a requirement on a machine builder to log interventions for it, and you've got to retain that for 5 years. So that could be syslog files, it could be more than that, it could be less than that. But watch this space.
Okay, great. Where can we find a link to the offline version of this presentation? Can you send this to us and we can put it on our website?
Yeah, sure.
So that will be on our website along with the video. Thank you, whoever that was. There was a question that I thought of. So we said that the new regulation comes into play on the 20th of January 2027, and you said that it doesn't comply on the 19th. But can people start complying before that, or should they hold off on what they're doing to do it on the day?
Yeah, no. So okay. So from a legal perspective, your machine would ship with declaration of conformity to the machinery directive up to the 19th. Then the 20th, your paperwork changes. But clearly, you're going to put something in effect before then. So I would say, for sure, start looking at your documentation and think about the changes that would be required for that.
Yeah.
Look at the change in the standards. Attend all the kind of seminars and webinars that are out there to kind of make your machine compliant in time. But there is a switch over, but you can put things in place now. You just can't ship the machine with that documentation until the 20th of January 2027. Yeah.
So the compliance that different then?
Yeah.
There's no sort of overlap. Cool, that's good to know. So another question is, who is responsible for cybersecurity fixes / patches, the OEM or the end user? Also the machine builder or the end user?
If you look at the machinery, well, I'm gonna go delve into another area here that this audience need to be aware of. I've not touched on it, but the regulatory landscape is changing. So I've just talked about the machinery regulation, but we also have the Cyber Resilience Act. That's pretty close to entering force either next month or the month after, certainly this year. And that deals with products with digital elements. So if you're affected by 1.1.9 moving forward, you're certainly going to be in scope of the Cyber Resilience Act. And we also have NIS2, which should have been transposed by the member states last week. There's only been Belgium and Croatia. So there's quite a massive cyber security requirements on the horizon. Sorry, Laurie, what was the question again? I rambled there.
Who is responsible for the cyber security patches?
Yeah, that's what I was coming back to. So if you look at the mix of regulations and directives, it depends who the persona is. There is a requirement on Machine Builder to inform end users of identified vulnerabilities, and that's quite an onerous task. So you've got a machine with 40 vendors who notify you of security issues, and then you're expected to let the end user know. Well, this could be a moving feast. So again, I think I would be looking to guidance as to what really are the requirements there. Do you provide that on a quarterly, annual? What is the basis? Because you could just about be doing that full time. I would say predominantly though the focus would be on the end user. They're certainly through NIS2 and through market surveillance. They're the ones that would cop it initially.
We've had another one come through, which is quite funny in some respects. Do you think the UK will deal with this change as with Brexit?
Make an absolute arse of it.
Yeah. I know everyone I've spoken to, and then I'll let you put your piece in, David. Everyone in sort of BSI is all talking about harmonisation. From a point of the industry, from the industry, I don't think anybody wants to do anything separate, which is why CE and UKCA has now all become almost one again. So hopefully not like Brexit. But what's your take on it, David?
So again, go back to that King's Speech, 4th of September. So just last month, and it had the metrology bill there, and it also had the Cyber Resilience Act, both of which kind of say that the UK can choose to align itself with European or international law or do its own thing. So it's still open to guesswork, I guess. I think it would be mad if you look at we're already under the auspices of NIS. We've got NIS2 to try and reinvent stuff. I think why put additional requirements on machine builders in the UK? So you're going to have to do something different to ship a machine to Europe as to what you would in the UK. I agree with you, Laurie. That we should be pushing for harmonisation.
Yeah, and that's the noise that I hear coming from any of the committees I've been involved in. It's all talk about harmonisation. So yeah, hopefully it'll be good.
Just a thought, Laurie. You were talking about having a kind of policy exchange with DPT, Department of Business and Trade. I think with this audience here, they should be pretty vocal on that front.
Yeah.
I know certainly when they did the roadshow, I attended a few of them, and everybody that attended the particular sessions were all of the same opinion. So,
yeah, we don't want to make it harder for everybody.
Exactly.
It needs to be easy. So so I think that's about it. If there's no more questions, but if you have, quickly pop them in. As I said, if not, you feel free. You can contact myself at Automate UK, and I'll pass them on to David, or I'll answer them on myself. I'll get you answers from someone relevant. If not, thank you ever so much for this afternoon. Thank you to David, and hopefully we'll see you again in another webinar in the near future on another topic that's hopefully helpful to everyone in the industry. So thank you.
Thank you, Laurie.